So, good evening. My name is Jay Horvitz from the International Channel of the MoFed Institute and from some other parts of MoFed. And I know this sounds strange a bit, but I'm actually honored to be able to introduce Martin Weller this evening. Because as someone who's been reading, I'm well versed in the English language educational blogosphere. And there are some names which anybody who deals with the educational blogosphere can't do without. I don't know whom you know and who you don't know, but we would mention people like Stephen Downes. We would mention people also who hasn't been blogging for years, but we used to read him, George Siemens. There's obviously Audrey Waters and some others which I read, which people may not be that familiar with. One of those people is Martin Weller, who I suppose his true claim to fame is being a professor at the Open University. By the way, I would like you to tell us if it's the Open University of England, of Britain, of the UK, or just the Open University. I could never figure out exactly how to do that. And although that may be his main title, as a consistently interesting blogger, I think that's even more of a claim to fame. And he blogged over a number of months, a series of posts about 25 years of EdTech, and then made it into a book. And that book is the basis for this evening's talk. I would only add to that before that one of the elements which is important for understanding this evening's meeting is that when I originally tried to organize it, I said we should have a retrospective on what's happening in EdTech and why it hasn't necessarily met the expectations of a generation ago. And then when everybody agreed, something called COVID-19 took place. And it sort of changed so many things that it made it almost simply confusing. At the very first weeks, I think I read everything from COVID-19 will change everything in education to COVID-19 will change nothing in education. I admit that back then I published something, posted something saying on the side that it won't change anything. I could be wrong. I won't promise. But the conception for this evening had nothing to do with coronavirus. To some extent, I think that's a positive thing, because when we deal with what's happened in education and technology in education, one of the things we have to understand about that is that there's very little understanding of the history of the program, of the topic. And so everybody who said everything is going to change may not have known what was there before. But I suppose we can't not deal with things that have to do with Corona, which I'm sure, which I already seen Martin intends to deal with. So I've babbled on long enough. I'm going to let him go in to his screen share. I think I will turn off everybody's microphones so that we'll be able to hear him. The chat is available for all of us. Feel free to ask questions there. And when we get to the period of questions, which may be in the middle and maybe at the end, of course, we'll open microphones and give all of us a chance to say something. If you would like, Mehmet, to ask a question which is better than which should be done verbally and not in the chat, feel free to raise your hand and we'll see that we can get around to that. Martin, it is my honor.
Okay, thanks very much, Jay. So I'm sharing screen now, I think. Yeah, cool. Everyone can see that? Good. Great, thanks. Yeah, I probably won't be able to follow the chat, so so if there is something you want, I'll rely on you, Jay, to kind of pick up in the chat box. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, Jay. Yeah, it's the UK Open University, although because we like to be arrogant, we were sort of the first with the name the Open University. Often we just say the Open University, so everyone should know who we are. But we do represent the 4 nations. So I live in Wales, and there's a Welsh office at the Open University in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England as well. So it does go across the 4 nations. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction, Jay. As Jay said, the talk I was originally going to give was around 25 years of EdTech, a kind of historical perspective, but partly that was always going to be based on why I think it's important to know that. But I think with COVID-19, that's kind of why you need to have a good appreciation of the history of EdTech, at least the recent history of EdTech, has kind of gained extra prominence. So I'm going to address that very specifically at the end. Oh yes, good. So an alternative title for this talk would be, I remember when all this was paper. And I think that the point of that is that it's been a very rapid change. It's like, so I joined the Open University 25 years ago, and I remember saying at my interview, was like, have you thought about using this web thing for teaching? It's like, and they took that as a deep knowledge of the web. But really, I was just bluffing it. But even then, it was still very new. And you think about where we are now, that's kind of how rapidly that's changed. So I think it's important, we've been through this really rapid period of change, and often when you're going through those kind of things, you don't have time to stop and look back and consider what's happened. Another alternative title is given where we are now, so why not some history of EdTech is a good idea in the pandemic, and that's what I'll come on to at the end of this talk. So Jane mentioned that I've published a book, so it's Creative Commons licensed. The digital version is free, so you can download it there. You can buy it, so it's published by Athabasca University Press, so you can get it there if you feel like buying it. I've also got, as part of my blog, I've sort of set up a site around the book, so all the extra bits and bobs, like you can download the graphics that have been created. For this talk, I'm using something called a remixer. So lots of my images you'll see are remixed versions of the book cover, which is the X-Ray Specs guide. And that was developed by my friend Brian Mathers, who runs a company called Visual Thinkery. And so the cool thing is you can go there and you can create your own version of those book covers and put whatever text you want on there and change the colours. You'll see different versions all the way through. That's the fun thing to go and play with. So just a quick bit about, in case you don't know me. So I work at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University, and so I've been there 25 years now. That's my Twitter handle, that's my blog. I'm the director of a research team called the OER Hub, so we look at the impact of open educational resources. We run a big project called GoGEM, which is a global network of OER PhD researchers. So if any of you are OER PhD researchers, get in touch with us. I've written 2 other books that were open access. One was Digital Scholar, which was published in 2011, and one was called The Battle for Open, which was looking at kind of how openness has changed. And also I'm the director of the Open program at the OU, which is our kind of multidisciplinary program, so students can pick and choose a number of different modules. So openness is kind of...
May I add something? May I add something that I think the version from 2 years ago of Innovating Pedagogy, which I think you were the main editor, or maybe perhaps not, was also done with the University of Haifa, with some of our compatriots here who aren't here this evening, but many of us have worked with them.
Yeah, I won't take too much claim for the Innovating Pedagogy report. So Mike Sharples and Rebecca Ferguson, I work with IET, developed that. So every year we do an annual report which looks at emerging trends, but not around technology, much more around kind of things you can do differently with pedagogy. And there's a website, if you look for Innovating Pedagogy, again, that's a Creative Commons publication you can look at. Cool. So the outline for this talk is I thought I'd talk about the approach I took for the book and why I decided to write a book. And then I'm not going to go through all 25 years. I think even for me that might take up too much time. But I'll pick out some of those technologies, I think, just because it kind of gives a good feeling of how things have changed. I want to pick out some common themes that emerge from those technologies then, and then talk about the sort of new bit, what it means in times of the pandemic. And then I hope we'll have time for discussion at the end. So the approach I took, I'm the president of the Association for Learning Technology in the UK, and in 2018 it was their 25th year, and I thought a foolhardy idea. I thought, what I'll do is I'll blog about a technology for the past 25 years, you know, that I've been involved with or that I thought significant. So I started this blog series, and it was really sort of based on my experience, and sort of rationale I had for including them was when I thought they became significant, so not necessarily when they were invented. And you can see that the sort of blog series put up there, and it became quite an interesting project actually. When I started, I wasn't sure I'd actually finish it, but it sort of gained quite a bit of interest, and it was actually useful for me to kind of reflect upon those things as I went through it. So having done that, I thought, you know, there's probably a book in this. So I then worked that up into a book. But just to kind of warn you, at the end of this talk, you're probably going to hate me, right? For any of you who know about education technology, because it's like all those lists. Like if it's a list of 100 films, you know, you all say, why? How on earth could you not have included this film? Or why is this film number one? This one. So I probably won't have mentioned your favourite technology, or I will have mentioned it, and you think I've probably misrepresented it. You think I've put things in the wrong year. Stephen Downs criticised me a lot for having things in the wrong year, or I missed something that you think is vitally significant. But that's kind of always the way with these kind of lists, and I think that's just the nature of the piece. In some ways, it's there to kind of discuss around it, I think. I also think the kind of approach I've taken of a technology per year is not very good for kind of longer, more abstract themes. So there might be themes around accessibility or issues around academic identity, those kind of things, which probably go across all of the technologies I've mentioned, but it's very difficult then to kind of just pull them out in one of them. So in some ways it's a good way to approach the topic, but you know, for every good methodology loses some things as well. I think it's probably not very good for those kind of much longer themes. It ends up being a bit technology focused. I've included some pedagogies and those kind of things in there, but it does end up being quite tech focused, and necessarily leads to some omissions, because you know, sometimes you actually find one year there are probably 3 or 4 contenders to put in and you can only choose one. But I want to kind of suggest, argue, press upon you that it's not just a nostalgia trip. It is actually quite fun as a nostalgia trip to think, who remembers bulletin boards and those kind of things. But actually there's something very useful about doing this, which brings me on to this, like, why did I write this book? Partly it's out of frustration. I get frustrated, particularly with the kind of rhetoric that surrounds a lot of education technology, particularly when it's coming from what you might call Silicon Valley, for a better phrase. You know, that there's this idea of this kind of year zero mentality, like everything's new, everything's just been invented. So MOOCs were a very good example of that. So when it was the year of the MOOC in 2012, people were saying things like, finally, higher education is understanding the internet, or it's the internet happening to higher education. And I launched a course in '99, which had 15,000 students, all completely online. And it's as if like none of this stuff has ever happened. You know, it's like, and I think it's a real danger that we forget that history. And also one of the things that people often argue is that higher education is incapable of innovation. So there's this idea around disruption, the theory that Christensen came out with, you know, that it takes people coming from outside of a sector to make change in it. So you'll often see these kind of claims that, you know, digital is going to happen to university, and if they don't evolve, they're going to die, and those kind of things. So I wanted to try and counter that narrative that there hasn't been innovation in higher education. But also I think there's a kind of issue around education technology. But one of the things about it as a field, I'm not sure whether to call it a field, a discipline, an area, a subject, whatever you want to phrase it, is that people come into it from different areas. I don't know what your backgrounds are, but if you go to a chemistry conference, for example, and you sit down at lunch with a table full of strangers, you're probably going to know that all of them have done chemistry degrees and PhDs, and you'll talk about chemistry. There'll be a kind of shared understanding of the basics of your topic. But if you sit down at a table at an EdTech conference, people around there may have done chemistry, they may be from philosophy, computer science, literature, and people come into it from many different areas. And in some ways that's its beauty, I think, because that kind of multidisciplinary approach brings lots of different perspectives to it. The people I work with have got philosophy PhDs, and so you get into discussions with them about what's the nature of truth, you know, and like you're still going 10 hours later and stuff. And I came from a psychology and artificial intelligence background and that sort of thing. So, but although I think that's a kind of a benefit of the field and a richness, it also means that people don't have a kind of shared understanding. And so that also can lead to this kind of reinventing the wheel kind of thing. So I wanted to provide one basis. I'm not saying my book's the only one, but at least kind of demonstrate that we have this kind of shared history that people can link into. So those are my reasons for writing the book, and also just I thought it was a kind of a fun thing to do. And one of the things I also draw out is that we need to be kind of critical of EdTech, which is not to say we need to be dismissive of it, you know, but you need to approach it with not with this kind of wow tech solutionism approach that technology is going to change everything, but to ask kind of serious questions of it. And by understanding the history, we'll see why you need to ask those questions and why things have failed and why some things have succeeded. So I think we tend to suffer from, you know, this kind of historical amnesia, and so I wanted my book to be a kind of an attempt to at least address some of that, or at least to kind of get discussion going around that. So this is one of Brian's cartoons, and I've often felt like this, you know, like in '94 we just invented online learning, then MOOCs come along, people go, oh, we invented online learning, and then in 2019 or perhaps 2020 it's like people are suddenly making that shift again. So it's been interesting to watch in terms of the pandemic, how many of exactly the same arguments against online learning have been coming up that we faced when I was developing this course in 1999. So I think, oh wow, I thought we'd solved all these answers. You know, I thought people had accepted that, you know, online learning isn't necessarily inferior to face-to-face, or online learning isn't cheaper, or all those kind of things. And it actually all the kind of same arguments are recurring now. So I think this is a good example of this kind of historical amnesia. So this is the full, and it only goes up to 2018 because books take a bit of time to come out. Although on the blog I've started doing, I'll carry on doing it. So I did for 2019, my entry was micro-credentials, and I'm pretty sure the online pivot will be my entry for 2020. So I'll carry on. So that's the kind of full list of technologies. So you see it goes from bulletin board systems and the web, include things like wikis, e-learning itself, standards, LMS and VLE, blogs, open educational resources, video, YouTube, Web 2.0, things like Second Life, virtual worlds, e-portfolios, personal learning environments, and so on. And I think the important thing to say is just because they're included in here doesn't necessarily mean that I think they're a good idea. So blockchain is a good example of that, and we'll come to blockchain later maybe. But I think, you know, I'm not saying these are significant in terms of they've had a real impact. I think they're significant often in terms of what they represent about educational technology. So I'm not going to go through 25. I'm going to pick out some of these, I think, just to kind of give us a flavour. So I'm kicking off with bulletin board systems. I don't know if any of you remember bulletin board systems. So they were the kind of early form of dial-up way of connecting to the internet, and they were based around this kind of visual metaphor of a bulletin board. You could stick different things on there, so it was a place you could connect to go. If you could find, you know, text files or libraries and chat to other people. So this kind of a very early, if you like, form of social networking. But because of the way they worked, you had to kind of have a direct connection to them. So you couldn't have lots of users simultaneously. And they were quite difficult to use back in '94, and you had to dial up modems, and they were quite expensive and stuff. And so in terms of education, they were quite niche, but we did start to use them in distance education, online education. But you mainly used them where the medium was also the message. So you'd use them in courses about computer communication, or, you know, using online communication for teachers, those kind of things, rather than a course about Shakespeare, for instance. So, but you can see them as really kind of precursors to Facebook and all that kind of social media, where you came to one place to do different things. And what's interesting at the time, lots of people dismissed them, said they'll have no relevance for higher education. No one wants to learn this way, those kind of things. And we did some analysis at the university, and there's a quote there, you know, about 60–70% of students said they felt they were less effective for contacting their tutor. getting help socialising, saving time and money. So they didn't really like them much. But the point is they were kind of good enough at the time to help us start thinking, particularly in distance education, that we could do some of the things that we couldn't do before. So it's just kind of recognising that possibility for us to do things before, even if actually they were a bit kind of clunky and awkward to use. And I think they represent a certain trend you get in that some technologies die out, and I think what bulletin and just disappear and you'll see them again, and other technologies morph into something that becomes a much more usable, universal application. And I think bulletin boards are an example of that. Although they were difficult to use at the time, they had in them the seeds of all the things that we use now. 1995, I've gone for the big one, if you like, the web. Of course, that isn't when it was invented, so just to re-emphasise my points about when I sort of feel it became significant. And around 95, it was easy enough for people to connect via things like Netscape, for those of you who remember it. And lots of universities started having web pages, and there was like a certain style to university web pages that you could recognise. And for those of you who know about the web, it's based on the language HTML, and Tim Berners-Lee developed HTTP, which is the way of passing data across it. And at the time, again, it was dismissed. But, people said HTML wasn't a very good markup language; it was too basic. And if you're really into using markup, there were lots of other kind of much more sophisticated options out there. And I think a really important lesson from that is that kind of good enough tends to win out in popularity if you can make it universal. So I remember sort of showing some of the tech nerds at the university the web, and they were going, "That's no good." It's like, look, I've got this Unix server and I can do FTP, and they were putting all these kind of like command line language programs in, and they could do all this stuff, and actually what they could do was more powerful than I could do with the web. But of course, not everyone was going to operate. That wasn't kind of universal enough. It wasn't going to be popular enough. And I think that principle of good enough wins out. You also see with things like Facebook. Facebook is actually really bad for lots of things. If you see companies that have their like little shops and businesses have their presence on Facebook, it's actually a really bad site to run your presence of, but it's kind of good enough in many ways. But the real thing about the web was it gave us the chance to publish, communicate, and share. So it kind of removed all those barriers in a way, and that was liberating. And I think in many ways that the point of making the end there is that we're still dealing with what the web brought us today. That everything that's for good and bad, all the problems around what happens on Twitter and all those kind of things, that all comes from what happens when you remove the filters to publishing online. And for distance education, which previously we'd spent all our time sending out or making TV programs or shipping physical copies of books, home experiment kits, it really changed everything we could do in a way. And I think, and this is a point that we're seeing more so, I think, in the pandemic. For us at the Open University, it made other universities like us, because they could then say, well, we can offer online program, we can offer distance education. And because we could do things like synchronous sessions and group work online, it made us more like other universities. So it changed that gap between distance education and face-to-face education. And we're seeing that kind of on boosters, if you like, I think, with the pandemic, as all universities switched to some form of online learning. So I'll skip a year. So what happened when people started teaching online was they started to think, do we need to teach the same way? And so although it wasn't developed for the web, pedagogic theories based around constructivism came to the fore. And the constructivism was very much about, you construct your own interpretation, your own meaning of things. And people liked that when it came to the web, because you suddenly had these, all these resources out there. People could interact with each other remotely. They could find different resources, bring them together. So it seemed much more kind of open. It wasn't just the idea of somebody lecturing. And the famous phrase at the time was, it was a shift from being the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. You were helping people through this stuff. And when I used to go to e-learning conferences in the late 90s, every paper would say, like, we've got a student-centered constructivist approach in our course. I often thought it didn't really make much sense. And often I think it was a kind of an excuse for poor design, basically, that I haven't really constructed it, I haven't really made this course or designed it. let students get on with stuff, but hey, I'm being constructivist, they're sort of finding out for themselves. And I think often it didn't work well for a lot of disciplines. It's difficult to kind of construct your own meaning, say, of quantum physics. But I think what was interesting about it was it showed educators sort of really thinking about, well, we can do things differently here. I think people got really excited, for example, around the idea of non-linear text, the fact that you can explore and go off, and that was a big deal in terms of constructing knowledge. And I think in some ways, because it was new, it made us think about that. And now all this technology doesn't seem so new. I think we've lost in some ways that perspective about what does it offer us that's new. And I think we're seeing that again with the pandemic. People are saying, oh, well, we'll Zoom our lectures, and we're kind of just replicating the old models of teaching instead of thinking of what does this allow us to do that's different and new. And I think so we've lost some of that experimental approach, I would argue. 98 I've put in as wikis. So I went to a conference and I saw someone talk about wikis. I thought, wow, this is it. This changes everything. It's the idea that everyone could work on the same document remotely and edit it and change it. That was kind of really very powerful. So the idea that it was open, anyone could change it, anyone can edit it, and you could create these kind of group projects based around it. And I came back full of enthusiasm at the Open University saying we should put all our courses on wikis, let the students construct the courses, edit them for future ones. And everyone just looked at me like I was mad. And so it didn't really happen. I think so. It's interesting to think. Here's an interesting question you probably never asked yourself: why aren't MOOCs in wikis? They're kind of massive courses. Lots of people bring their knowledge to them. Why don't we have them wikis that people can construct and change and edit and improve upon as we go along? And there are probably lots of answers to that. I still think they're a bit techy to use, and there's a kind of threshold to using them that could put people off. There's also issues around quality, obviously. People like to control stuff, and there are kind of cultural issues about some people like to have the kind of perceived wisdom given to them rather than sort of feeling like they're developing it. And in some ways, what wikis did give us was the editing approach. That was the most important thing. How do you go about editing, and what are the protocols for agreeing who should make changes? And Wikipedia developed that most. And I think Wikipedia is a really interesting project. In some ways, it always sounds completely insane, like it shouldn't work. Here's an encyclopedia that anyone can edit. Like, why is it not just completely garbage? And I know lots of the press and the media like to paint it as unreliable, but actually it's usually really good. I think it's not that there are some mistakes or errors in it, it's that there are so few of them. I think that's the amazing thing. So, but I still think in terms of education, we probably didn't do enough with wikis. We still don't do enough. And I wonder if that comes down to a kind of cultural feeling about control and quality, which goes back to that issue of what the web raised for us. How am I doing for time? It's half 7. Okay, cool. I might zip along a bit. So 2000, I put in learning objects. This is interesting. So learning objects were reusable chunks of learning. So the idea came very much from object-oriented programming. And in an object-oriented program, the idea was you reused kind of self-contained chunks of code. So you could reuse a shopping cart from one program in another program. Change those things about. People thought, why can't we do that with learning? And Stephen Downes wrote a kind of good argument for them. If you've got a description of a sine wave, why does everyone repeat that? Why don't you just have 2 or 3 of those that are shared around the world? And lots of money went into learning objects. The idea was you gather these learning objects together. They're described by metadata. You put them into a repository. And then you come along and you just pull out the learning objects you need and assemble them into a course. Now, I spent a lot of time in learning objects, and I still bear the scars. But they didn't really take off. And I think there's a number of reasons why they didn't take off. First of all, they were over-engineered. They're actually really quite difficult to use and describe and stuff. And metadata would end up with like 27 different fields that you were supposed to fill in to describe something. We also had lots of debates about what is a learning object, as academics like to do. So some people it was anything that can be used in learning. So it could be a stone, but even if you just took a digital, that could be a picture, or is it a course, or is it something that's been designed specifically with a learning outcome? So there's kind of lots of debates around that. David Wiley came up with the reusability paradox. He said, something to be reusable, it needs no context. You can take it and put it in a different context. But for learning to be useful, it needs to have as much context as possible. So those two things are in competition with each other, and learning objects kind of fell into that paradox. I think they were kind of very unfamiliar for lots of educators. They just didn't get the idea of sharing learning content. I think maybe the world wasn't ready, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Education is also quite messy. You can share bits of code quite easily. You know, this shopping cart will work over there just the same. But even for things that you might think you want to share, actually the way you might want to use them in a psychology course might be different from how you want to use it in an engineering course. And so you couldn't do that kind of change as easily. And I think also there was a lot of reluctance from educators. They didn't like to share their content. They kind of felt a lot of their personal, professional identity was wrapped up in that content. But I think it's interesting now to think, you know, now all universities are trying to go online at the same time. It really, perhaps now is the time for learning objects. You know, there wasn't a kind of strong enough argument, wasn't a strong enough reason to invest in them previously. But now you could argue that there might be. That, you know, why are we all going to try and create the same courses online? We could just have a bank of really good quality content that you can put together and develop courses with. Virtual learning environments or learning management systems, depending on your preferred phrase. So a virtual learning environment was the kind of the enterprise system. So what we had up until this point, lots of universities were developing online stuff, but it would vary all across. So the maths faculty might have a different system to someone in the medicine faculty, and some of them were brought in, some of them were developed by some bloke down the corridor and stuff, and they were kind of all, you've got a very kind of mixed picture, this kind of cottage industry. So universities wanted to kind of apply an enterprise approach across the institution, and that was good actually. And what that allowed us to do was say, okay, now we've all got the same system, we can centralise lots of things like staff development, student support, students get a universal kind of experience. It allowed people to then really ramp up how the institutions did their e-learning, and they were good enough. They were example of this kind of good enough principle. But what happened, I think, is this idea of what you can call sedimentation. So once we got them, sediment began to build up around them. That sediment you could view as things like all the kind of administrative process around implementing something new on the VLE, all the resources from IT, and that was built to support the VLE, those kind of things. So it became very difficult to do anything that wasn't the VLE, anything outside of that. And so that actually became a bit of a barrier to innovation.
Martin, Sam writes that he's struggling to grasp the concept of a learning object. He would like to get an example.
Okay, so a learning object might be a simulation, say, of a sine wave. So this is how a sine wave operates, and you could adjust some parameters, a multimedia simulation that people can then share. So I could develop it, and you could take it, and you could put it in your VLE. But it might be a short video as well. So I think the Khan videos might be good examples of how learning objects have actually come to be realised. Yeah, sorry if I didn't make that clear. Yes, I think that we kind of had this thing of we began to see as a kind of a barrier to innovation. And I foolishly declared the VLE is dead in 2007. It certainly isn't dead. It's carried on. So I think what the VLE really represents is this tension within universities between allowing freedom and innovation to happen, but also maintaining a kind of robust system that, you know, allows pupils and students to study and know that it's there and it's not going to be flaky and falling over. And that's actually, it's easy to kind of say we want to do all this kind of innovative stuff, but often those systems are quite difficult to use and they don't suit everybody. So I think getting that balance right is often difficult. 2003 are blogs I've come up with. So again, they sort of began to be popular around then. I started blogging about 2006. I think the interesting thing about blogs is they really fit into a lot of academia. So before the kind of social media, what they really allowed was for academics and students to develop a kind of online identity. And I see my blog, for instance, as the real kind of central point of my academic identity. And there are other things that spring off of that, some more formal and less formal. But I think it was a really good tool. It is a really good tool to allow informal discourse around lots of topics. And so the things that, so you can publish a paper, but actually a paper is, journal articles in a very kind of stylized format. And actually what you want to say is often things around that paper. And so blogs give you that place to, and a place to do things like public engagement, outreach, and impact. And I still argue that blogging was the best decision I ever made back in 2006 when I decided to set up my blog. And it's how I got to meet lots of educators online. And I think Jay said that's how he's sort of come across me, really. So I think it was before social media democratized the online space, a lot of it was done through blogging. And I still think it's the scope of blogging suits academia perhaps more than some of the other forums. 2006, I've got this Web 2.0. I think are you giving a presentation about Web 2.0, Jay? So I won't say too much about it. Well, Web 2.0 was one of those things that came along, and for a while it was everywhere. So things. The difference about Web 2.0 was meant to be much more kind of collaborative, so that differentiated from Web 1.0. This kind of participatory culture things. So included things like blogging, but also social media, Flickr, the things where suddenly everyone could produce stuff, but also comment on it, and things like being able to tag things, what we call taxonomies, as a way of classifying systems. But it was also, it led to kind of quite a big bubble, obviously, and there was kind of a big backlash against it. And I remember going to a conference in America around this time, and everybody had their own Web 2.0 business. It's like they were giving out business cards. My one does this, my one allows you to add a little laugh to something, or just and hoping to get bought out. And there was never a business plan for any of these things. But I think once all that kind of hype has passed away, there is a kind of legacy about the whole Web 2.0 approach, which I think it made us think about how we conduct many of our processes. David Weinberg talks about this shift from filter on the way out and not the way in. So if you think about publication, for instance, academic publication, what we do is we have a very strong filter on the way in. Only so many papers have to be reviewed, and only those ones get published. Whereas the Web 2.0 approach is to allow everything to be published, but then there are methods for filtering on the way out, such as like recommendation systems, those kind of things. And you've seen that with things like the archive physics pre-repository dump. So the only filter is on there is that it looks like it'd be something that would be sent out for review. They just publish it, and then people comment on it, and so they've removed a lot of that kind of barrier. And I think also it kind of raised the question about how much could we, or should we, allow students to generate content and be participatory in that. And I think from a technology point of view, it made us think beyond our very specialised educational systems and starting to use other systems that could just do things better than we could. It's like we'd labour over these kind of very specialised educational tools, and actually then someone would come along with something like Twitter. Okay, that just does it better, doesn't it? And it also makes us think about open approaches, sharing and putting stuff online as a default. Which brings us on to Twitter. So I put this 2009, so Twitter was founded in 2006, but by about 2009, Twitter and other social media, things like Facebook, were kind of really becoming part of the popular discourse. And I think it raises lots of interesting issues for education. So the decided context collapse, in physical spaces, you separate context very clearly. So you go to the student coffee bar or whatever with your friends, and you behave in a certain way there, and you behave a different way maybe in a face-to-face tutorial with your tutor, and then a different way again when you're at home with your parents. And online, all those contexts collapse into one, and it becomes very difficult to maintain these slightly different identities that you have elsewhere. And students find that very difficult if suddenly their professor is following them on Twitter or chatting to them on Facebook and stuff. It's like, and they're also posting pictures of partying the night before. So I think it's quite difficult for in terms of identity, and students often struggle with that. There's also this issue about how much we should encourage students and staff to develop things like Twitter profiles. In some ways, it's a really good space for sharing, and it's how you form your personal learning network and stay up to date on lots of things. But also, it's a place that's full of toxic trolls and all those kind of things. So I think it brings with it a kind of real duty of care for those of us in higher education. Like, as soon as you start saying you really should get online, and you've got to do better if you do have an online profile, whether that's a blog or a Twitter profile or something, you are forcing people online who may have very good reasons not to be online. And also, we're kind of playing into this whole model of data capitalism and invasion of privacy, all this stuff around Facebook, adverts being used to kind of promote things. And I think there's I go around this a lot, actually. So at some point you want to say, oh, it's a really toxic space, let's just get out of there. But at the same time, it's like, why should we surrender that space to the alt-right and the Nazis and the conspiracy theorists and stuff, when actually it's a really useful and helpful and collaborative space for a lot of the time. So I think for us in education, it's really important to understand its role in society and to do research effectively into that, but also to know how we can use it effectively and how it can work. So not just Twitter, but all kind of social media. And also, I think it's part of our role to be present in society. So it's easy enough to say, I don't do that stuff, but actually, if that's where things are being decided, the president of the US is, doing most of his policy decision making, then it's kind of ignorant in some ways to kind of say you're not in that space. But it does generate lots of issues, I think, for us. I don't think we know how to deal with it. So 2012 is the year of the MOOC, so massive open online courses. So they suddenly took off when Sebastian Thrun ran an AI course that had 100,000 people on it, and the media became very interested in this idea of free education. And everyone was saying it's the end of universities. And Sebastian Thrun famously said, I think in 5 years' time, whatever, there's only going to be 10 global providers of higher education. Of course, that wasn't true. So now that MOOCs, it was interesting to kind of go through that MOOC model, because it was kind of everywhere all of a sudden. It was in the popular press, and we work at Open University. Suddenly people saying to us, why aren't you doing MOOCs? You should be doing MOOCs. They're going to get rid of you. It's like, that's the end of the Open University. And there were lots of kind of these thought pieces about MOOCs. And then they sort of went away a bit. And now they've sort of settled into a model of being useful, I think, in some places. But I still don't think we know if there's a sustainable business model for them. They're trying to make money on certification, but they still rely on universities providing free content to them. So I still don't know what the business model is really for MOOCs. I think some are edging towards it. Future Learn are getting there, I think, in some ways. It's interesting about who they are actually good for. The big claim at the time was they're going to democratize higher education. Everyone can learn, and there's all these kind of stories that people would always put out about, poor kids in developing nations suddenly becoming experts in engineering. But actually, when people did the research, beyond the kind of the nice anecdotes, it turns out the people who actually completed MOOCs were already well-educated people in developed countries. So, like, in some ways, they were increasing the digital divide rather than decreasing it. The question I often ask myself is, like, what's all that hype around it good for educational technology and open ed? Even though a lot of it was obviously rubbish and nonsense, it did sort of suddenly put open education on the map. Suddenly, people who had been ignored for years, that their telephone was ringing and their vice chancellor was saying, "What's all these MOOCs things? Come and tell me about open education." So I still don't know whether they're a good thing or not in many ways. But I do think they're a kind of fascinating case study, I think, of what happens when educational technology suddenly gets lots of investment and lots of interest. A question to ask, I think, particularly in our current context, is when it's a MOOC just online learning, we started having all these variations on MOOCs. We had SPOCs, which were small private online courses. I couldn't work out why that was just different to what an online course, which should always sound, just variations of MOOCs. And another interesting question is we've been working in open educational resources for a long time, and they'd kind of been steady but they were the sort of the unsexy cousin of MOOCs in a way. And it's interesting, why did MOOCs get all the attention but OER didn't? Why did they get all those headlines? Was it something about the way they were pitched? Because you could argue that exactly the same things could have been argued for open educational resources. 2014, learning analytics, so a popular topic now. The idea that students spend a lot of their time in online environments, but also even when on the campus, they're just, David Wiley uses this term, data exhaustion. Students are just shedding data wherever they go. If they go to the library and take books out, that's all recorded. And if they're using mobile phones or different apps, then you kind of know where people are and what they're doing, or their sort of digital footprint online. So learners create this data, and from that data you can then perform some kind of analytics and see what's happening. And the idea is that then you'll have some kind of intervention, possibly. So this student seems to be struggling, perhaps we should give them a call or speak to them. So that's the kind of learning analytics model. And I think learning analytics really represent a core dilemma for a lot of educational technology. There are potentially real benefits, and I think for distance learners, you can see learning analytics is somewhat like looking at the faces of students in a classroom. You can suddenly tell if people are bored or struggling, or they can't understand what you're saying, or they're talking to each other, and you might change what you're doing in a face-to-face classroom. It allows you to do that at a distance by seeing that perhaps these students keep coming back to this same piece, or they're spending on this resource than you thought. But there's also issues around kind of learner autonomy and agency, like how much do we let them control and how much do we interfere? Issues around privacy, of course, if you're monitoring what students do. And there's this whole kind of thing about we stop seeing students as people, we start seeing them as data points. And I think that's a very kind of dangerous mental game to get into once you start going down there. Of course, it's possible to misuse data analytics, so you can start rejecting students who you think are going to cost you too much money to support. Attract investment, people like it, it's kind of data, it's very computer based, it feels like the future, and it generates lots of hype. And people make lots of big claims for learning analytics, which aren't necessarily borne out by reality. So I think negotiating the path through these as educational technologies is actually quite difficult. It's easy to go down one side or the other. They're either brilliant or they're completely dangerous. We should not do them. And I think getting that balance right is actually quite difficult. Blockchain. So many of you have heard of blockchain. The idea that you can store data on this distributed ledger. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but it crops up everywhere. Blockchain. It's the solution to anything. And so when we're still going through Brexit, when they were proposing the solution to the border problem in Northern Ireland and Ireland, one of our ministers said, I think we should use blockchain. He didn't know why that would be a good thing, but he was just sure blockchain would solve the problem. And I think it's an example of, in the book I talk about this idea of alchemy, EdTech alchemy. It's like, you've got this magical thing that's going to solve your problem. You don't need to worry about it. Don't look inside it. It's just brilliant. It's going to do anything. And it's always promoted as the kind of next big thing. But actually, I'm never entirely sure what the problem is that blockchain is solving. It's a solution in search of a problem rather than a problem that's going to be solved. So coming up to 2018, which is the last chapter in the book, I talked about the kind of a dystopian turn where I think one of the things that really comes out is when you look at those early years of education technology, there's kind of filled with a lot of optimism and hope, and we can do things in a different way. We can really change the way we do things and reach new people, and it's going to be really brilliant. And actually, towards the end of those 25 years, when we look at things like artificial intelligence, blockchain, learning analytics, there's this real sense of like, although they're all potentially useful, there's kind of sense that also there's a kind of dystopian view of how technology can be used. So Chris Gillard is very good at talking about invasive use of technologies to monitor people, things like the doorbell, the Ring doorbell that's kind of used then to monitor your street. Audrey Waters always writes very well about the kind of social and political uses of EdTech. And Mike Caulfield has done excellent work on misinformation. And so I think we need to bring critical voices to educational technology, not just kind of accept them. I won't go into some detail now. So I think some of the themes that we pull out now, looking back over the 25 years, is that I think up until now, if you like, the technology part of EdTech has been the more significant part. And I wonder now whether we're starting to see a shift to thinking much more about what does the education part of that phrase mean. I think over recent years, we've seen this idea that the code is neutral or algorithms are neutral. It's not really a valid stance anymore. We have to kind of understand the social impact of these technologies and engage with that. One interesting thing I think we see is this idea, we have these recurring ideas. So artificial intelligence has come around at least twice, I think, as a kind of topic of interest in those 25 years. And things like reuse of content. So it went through learning objects, which didn't quite work. Then we've had open educational resources. And now maybe we're coming back to some version of learning objects again. But I think what it really points out is that through all of this, humans are still important in the educational process, and you have different types of technology. The desire of some technology is to replace humans, I think, whereas the desire of other technologies is to support the human educator. And I think one of the things I would say is that, going back over those 25 years, you can see there's a real kind of history of innovation in higher education. And I think the idea that it can't innovate in that space is not borne out by that analysis. So I just wanted to talk in the last few minutes about what does it mean in time of pandemic. So suddenly EdTech is now very relevant. So I was joking to my friend Brian, who did the artwork, that it's like, I feel like I'm now like one of those cops who's like hanging off the things on a helicopter saying, I'm getting too old for this shit. It's like suddenly like EdTech has become the emergency service that you didn't know it was going to be. And what that means is you'll see lots of people are going to be trying to sell you a solution like, this stuff is really difficult, you need to do it, but it's too complex, don't worry, we'll do it for you, just give us lots of money. So I think particularly people in senior management or people they rely on to help them need to have a good understanding about what's been done before, what's worked, what hasn't, and why those things worked or didn't work. And I wanted to give a couple of examples. So I've already seen lots of people saying, we're going to get rid of exams, which I think might well happen. We've seen exams are kind of a weak point in the whole higher education process. So we're saying what you need to do is blockchain, because that means we can gather all these little bits of assessment that people do all along the way and put them on the blockchain. So, that sounds like a good idea. But I think it's worth asking, so what does it do exactly on a blockchain? And we could do all these things before with an e-portfolio. So what does it do that an e-portfolio couldn't do? And e-portfolios have been quite successful, but they've been around since like 2002. And even then, they've not really changed higher education as much as we might have thought they would have done, as people claimed they would have done. We still have exams, for example. So how is blockchain going to overcome the problems that an e-portfolio hasn't overcome? Because actually those problems are nothing to do with technology. They're nearly always to do with things like acceptance from employers, changing your pedagogy to suit it, getting people to work with this new technology and those kind of things. So there are kind of social problems, if you like, social economic problems rather than technical problems. So unless you know about this stuff already, then you can easily be sold that blockchain is the first way to attempt to do this. And I've talked about learning objects. And this idea of reusable content might well come to the fore again. So it'd be interesting to think, it's good to know what were the problem learning objects that I went through, some of those ones. And so now that we know those might have been the problems, how can we overcome them this time if we really want it to work? But also if you're thinking about open educational resources, what's the best way to use them? How do we know when they're effective? There is lots of evidence of how people have implemented open educational resources and what the barriers to resistance are. So just that, in this case, there's a rich history to draw on rather than just thinking we're going to start from scratch on this. And lastly, the good old VLE, I think lots of universities and colleges are thinking, oh my God, we've got to go online. Like, you already have a VLE, most of them. And what you want to think about is how you might want to move beyond it, but you don't need to get rid of it. And in this case, the technology isn't the main thing really. You can do quite a lot of the VLE with a bit of imagination and a bit of staff development around understanding online pedagogies and different things you can do. So it's not that you need to have a technology solution. The technology you've got might well be good enough. What you need is kind of an understanding of innovative pedagogy. So finally, in conclusion, there is this long history of EdTech innovation in education. So higher education doesn't need saving from external forces. It's not to say we can't work with external providers. And I think understanding this history and where we've been before, I think it's essential to making good decisions now, particularly at a kind of point of crisis when it's easy to make the wrong decision because you're panicking. And so I thought for discussion, these are just some topics, but feel like to discuss whatever you want. Whether my reasons for writing the book you think are valid, you may not. If there are technologies you think should have been covered in the 25 years that I didn't cover. Some of those themes I pulled out. The relevance to the pandemic and how we might either state this relevance more or not. Or particularly how it's working in your context and what are some of the issues that are coming up there where this might be relevant. So I'm going to finish there. Good. Thank you. Shall I leave this up or stop sharing? Perhaps if I stop sharing, we can.
So I stopped your share.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Okay, first off, I want to thank you very, very much. And other people have now come in with their cameras as well. I want to jump into a question even before I give some more. There are some things in the chat if you didn't really see as you were sharing. I want to make one comment though about the last part that you dealt with. You deal specifically or particularly with higher education. Some of us are also more connected to K-12. And I think when we talk about K-12, one of the questions we asked in the time of pandemic is, what is education for? Or not education, what are schools for? Because what we found is that schools are a place where the government can then give hot breakfast to children who can't get it someplace else, and therefore they need school. Or a school is a place where you can put the children when the parents have to go to work. And these are not necessarily educational reasons, these are societal reasons, which, how would I say, to my dismay, no amount of educational technology is going to change. These are things that are going to be affected by the way society determines its priorities and not by the technologies that we may use in education.
Yes, I think you're right. So, my focus, and I did be focused on sort of further and tertiary education.
By the way, but also in higher education, we have part of the same problem there in terms of who can actually has the time to go to study for higher education, who in the time of pandemic can open their books and read, and who has to be taking care of their children or has to be going to work. And I think many of us in Israel have been working in teachers' colleges where we have people who don't have that time, who are now totally torn between trying to continue their own education and taking care of their kids and taking care of other things which are more pressing.
So I'll address that one first. So that's obviously true. And that one of the ways you get around that, or try to at least alleviate some of that, is by going for some of the sort of design principles we have for the Open University, because that's always been the case with our Open University students, and that's why students come to us. Because they were, the whole point was they were blocked, that it was called the University of Second Chance in the UK for a long time, because they couldn't go to formal education because they were caring, or they couldn't have children, or that they didn't want to go and study full time for whatever reason. And so it's part-time education usually. And the thing about it is it's asynchronous, so that's why the whole model of just replicating, a synchronous session becomes very restrictive and non-inclusive for lots of people. Because if you're meant to just sit down and sit in lectures from 9 to 5 every day, and you've got childcare, and that's obviously restricted. But the whole point of lots of distance education is that it's asynchronous. So the idea is you can fit it around your time. And we spend a lot of time at the university, in a way, teaching our students how to be learners, how to be distant students. I think that's going to be a real issue for lots of people. So it's not something lots of people are used to, and it takes a lot. There's a lot more responsibility that comes with you as a distance learner, online learner. That's the way I sort of to think about it is when you go to a campus university or campus school, the building, the architecture does a lot of the work for you. You turn up at room X at a certain time to get content, whether that's your lecture or lesson. You go to room Y to kind of have the group work and discussion tutorial. You go to the library for your resources, and you go over here to have socialisation. And socialisation is very important. You go to the bar or the cafe. The students who form social bonds, there's evidence that they're usually much more likely to continue studying and feel motivated. So that campus architecture is doing a lot of work for you as a lecturer that you don't even need to worry about, if you like. And when you move online, you need to kind of explicitly recreate those things in your course design. So you need to build in social aspects such as icebreaker activities, collaborative work, but also you need to help students. They need to do a lot of that work as well. So they need to think about organising their own study, and organising their own space to study as well. And so we give lots of advice to students. Get agreement from your family. These are the times I'm studying, or when I go in this room and I put this sign on the door, it means do not disturb. Or these. So, but actually, just all those things that you don't necessarily have to do as a student on a face-to-face campus. So it comes with lots of kind of other issues around it, but you can get around them. But I still think it's hard. It's much harder work, if you like, and not everyone's ready for that agency. But one of the benefits is it does come with agency and freedom in a way. It's like you get to construct your timetable and decide when I'm going to work this week. And actually, I hate work. I hate studying, having a 9 o'clock lecture because I'm only half awake usually, and I'm a night bird. But I'm really ready to study at 10 p.m. or whatever. So people have different time frames as well for many different periods. So there are kind of benefits for it. And again, if you're studying at home, you have restrictions around your time zone. So we have lots of great stories of people who amazing things as Open University students who pass their degrees whilst doing all these other kind of caring responsibilities or holding down jobs, all those kind of things. So it's certainly possible, but it does come with other issues. On the school front, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. A friend of mine who did lots of research schools and used to call them like an acceptable prison for children. That was their main function in society. And that you are right. And much like the early internet made us think, what is it we're trying to do with education? This pandemic's makes us think like, what is the function of schools? Is it just to look after kids so we can go to work? And if everyone's working at home, does that still apply? So I think, for all the claims I kind of make about education technology, I'm not a kind of technology solutionist. I think absolutely, particularly for young children, I can't imagine. My daughter's 18 now. I can't imagine trying to teach her as a 5-year-old at home. It's like. So I've enormous respect for teachers. I think lots of people are also discovering that. So yeah, I'm not necessarily thinking that all schools will go online, but I think we might well see, and the same with universities. I think we'll see a blending of approach now, perhaps much more. So this idea of the flipped learning approach, I think, might come into play. But even again, that has kind of inclusion, elitist problems. If you come from a nice middle-class background where you can go and watch a video online and then go into school, that's fine. But if you're in a more chaotic household, often school being the place where you go to do the work, you don't have to worry about it at home, is very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm going to open this up for anyone who would like to. Let me just open your. That wasn't nice of me. I've now unmuted all of you. Please don't yell at the same time, but if someone would like to take a... Sam, you'd like to say something?
Thank you. Firstly, thank you very, very much. I found that very, very helpful and give a broad context to this phenomenon of EdTech. I think it's a follow-up from Jay's question. What sense do we have of what kind of education EdTech is good for or works for, and what kind it doesn't. I mean, you were saying, for example, asynchronous learning, it does very well, but socialization, it doesn't do as well. What other kinds of learning things are the tools we currently have helpful for?
So you can do all subjects, and it's one of the things we've kind of learned at the Open University. It's not that you can only do certain disciplines, so you can cover all the disciplines you want. Sometimes you have to be more creative. Certainly we used to do lots of things with STEM, lots of home experiment kits, but we've actually got a really good thing called the Open STEM Labs at the Open University, where students can come online and they can engage in experiments, and they can simultaneously, there'll be a video, and the instructor will say, what will happen when I add this reagent to this chemical? Will it go up, down, whatever, and everyone guesses, and you can see like what the guesses are. So actually it's really good for a lot of that collaboration on quite a light way, kind of what you might call cooperative learning. So like, you don't necessarily need everyone to do something hard, just voting is a good thing to do, or just seeing what other people do. I think one of the things it's not particularly good for in some ways is group work. So we do group work a lot of the time, but things you can do easily in an afternoon in a kind of face-to-face group are much more difficult to realise online. So you might have a group work where people take on different roles, and they might spend 10 minutes going, well, I'll be the project manager, or I'll be the communications person, whatever. Whereas online, particularly if you're doing it asynchronously, that can take like weeks to organise because somebody's disappeared, you haven't heard from them, somebody doesn't want to do it, but they don't want to say. And so I think a lot of those things that are actually easily handled face-to-face can be quite difficult to negotiate online. But having said that, there is obviously, you can do a lot of stuff now synchronously. So I think judicious use of synchronous can really get around some of those things. And also I think increasingly it's going to be a good skill to have to be able to do online group working. But I do think sometimes just that kind of face-to-face stuff works a lot better for those kind of intensive group tasks. And I think you're right about socialization. It's still interesting. So I run this group GoGN, which is this global network of OER researchers. And we still, well, up until this year, we brought them together for a 2-day seminar before a conference usually. And then afterwards they would sort of share stuff with each other. But those 2 days were enormously bonding, so we'd bring them together wherever the conference was. So it was in Cape Town one year and Galway another year. And all the students who've been to that, it was a different bunch each year, kind of go on to form lifelong friendships or something. And there's just something about, going out with each other in a different domain, often out of your own context, and you sort of form that kind of bond that you don't get necessarily online. But having said that, I think all of us have probably formed lots of good friendships and partnerships online with people. A lot of people I know through blogging and social media have become proper friends. I wouldn't say they were lesser friends than the people I met face to face, but I do think some of those intense bonds form better face to face.
Thank you. Someone else? Wendy, you?
Yes, thank you for that. I wanted to sort of confirm what you were saying earlier about, I actually did study with the OU in Scotland as a mature student, and I transferred from Edinburgh University to the OU because I had a mother dying, I had very young children, I lived in the back of beyond, and childcare was incredibly expensive. But it suited me very well to study online. I don't think that is the case for those students. I'm quite an autonomous learner, so it suited me very well for all sorts of reasons. But I have a sister who would have hated it and couldn't have coped with being online, who needed that contact and safeness almost of being in a classroom situation with the teacher present. So I think our personalities as well as our life circumstances makes for easier for some students than others. I don't know if you found that, Martin, but
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I read a piece of research the other day, and perhaps it's kind of stating the obvious, but we're looking at preferences for online learning and campus-based face-to-face learning. And people who choose online learning like online learning, and people who choose campus learning like campus learning. But of course, the problem we're getting now is people who've chosen campus learning having to do online learning, and so that's going to pose a problem. You know, perhaps much like your sisters, like some people really want that kind of face-to-face experience.
But I think what you were saying about blended works very well, because I studied humanities, so for me studying online and having a package of books, I did this years ago, was fine. But laboratory work would have been something else entirely different.
Yeah, so my daughters wants to go to university in September, but who knows whether they will. But some universities are talking about having this kind of rolling thing of where, like, you know, a third of the students on campus, they can do social distancing. So you come on campus for 4 weeks, then go home for 8 weeks, and come back on campus for 4 weeks. And apart from the kind of logistics of trying to organise that in terms of accommodation and that, you can see how that might work. You know, it's like you have a bit of that campus experience and you do that, but then you go off campus and you can do some of the, and you've made some of those bonds that I was just talking about, you know, some kind of social bonds, but you do some of the studying.
Sorry, I was going to say, what you're describing is how I studied when I was a student nurse.
Right.
It's block learning. So I would work on a ward for 6 weeks and then go into school where we were all together. Well, there were only 24 of us. So it wasn't always done in sequence. I could be looking at pediatrics, but in fact I was working in orthopedics at the time. But at the end of 3 years, it all sort of fell into place, and it worked very well, actually.
Yeah.
And it was very public. All the learning was done on public on the wards, not in units, you know.
Yeah, so you might do kind of block.
Again, I think it's your personality.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, it may be right. So they're kind of block learning, but in terms of the modality of the delivery rather than the kind of topic and all.
If we're dealing with online or campus, I think it's interesting that the University of Phoenix in the United States is a totally online campus that has a football field, and their football field brings in a great deal of money for them when they rent it out for various games. So yes, it's strange but true. Is there another question? I would let me jump in with one of my other questions before we get on. You were talking about learning objects and about how, to a certain extent, the MOOC has inherited the learning object idea. But I think of the fact you were talking about they could be used in other situations. The object could be placed in another course, in other areas that it could be used. Michael Sandel from Harvard had his course Justice, which was, he's a star. He's a big person. He's someone who everyone would want to study with. And this course was on edX when San Jose State University said, pardon me, the philosophy department of San Jose State said, we don't want his course. We want to teach our students the way which fits for them, and they're not Harvard students. So really the idea that one size fits all, although it may sound very nice for someone who wants to invest money, is far and away not the same thing as how people learn.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think Melody wanted to come as well, but I'll just respond.
Yeah, just sort of a comment. Maybe this was not the forum or the lecture time to discuss this, but the online courses and working with all the technologies is just a beautiful art form for having all sorts of applications for students to do projects. And it's sort of a shame that that online sometimes just stays with lecture or asynchronous, small little items that people have to learn.
Melody, thanks for saying that.
Huh?
Thank you for saying that. I'm glad to hear you say that.
Listen, all I learned that was great is from Jay Hurwitz. I just wanted you to know. He taught me at Aqua before Moodle was born, and he put the course together, and I kicked and fought. Don't make me do Moodle, but of course Moodle is very, very, very lovely. But the beauty of online is that kids can use applications with Padlet, with I just learned Quick yesterday, where they get to do their own movies. So with my grandkids in the other room, we're making movies. This is the online stuff that you don't get to in classrooms. So I think the conversations almost has to be in that area of what are the amazing things that can happen when kids are online, unlike what I saw today, which is student teachers teaching with great technology, but they weren't teaching anything. You know, they did this, they did this. This is like, what's happening? There's no learning going on except technology.
Or they were teaching to the test.
I think what that gets, what one of the changes that needs to happen is around assessment. So the sort of thing you're talking about, around these kind of much more project-based assessment or problem-based assessment. And, you know, I mentioned constructivism and all those sorts of pedagogies really came to the fore when e-learning was new. People saying, like, let's teach this way. So you give students what you call an ill-structured problem where there's not one perfect solution. Maybe as a group, they have to kind of go off, find the right resources to solve it. They come up with a project, they build themselves. And that's a much kind of richer assessment. And it almost seems like we've kind of lost a lot of that innovation that happened, and we're still sort of teaching to the exam stuff. And I think one thing that may well come out of this is that there'll be a reaction against exams, you know. And so that one of the kind of very disappointing things is where people have just gone, okay, so how do we do exams online? And they've gone to these exam proctoring services where people like watch the student do the exams. Like, that's not the way to do it. You know, there's all these other forms of assessment you can do that would be much more rich for learners and entertaining and kind of engage and all this kind of thing. So replicating that model, I think, is not the way to go. And I think we'll see a shift away from that as a result of the pandemic.
Yes, someone else?
I wanted to just step in here and say that this may be a modality that will accommodate a lot of other learning styles, learning disabled students, because it's not just straight book learning, because it allows greater flexibility in terms of time and access to a wider variety of materials. And what you were mentioning about modalities, it's both teaching modalities and learning modalities. And much has been said and done over the last 3 or 4 decades about students with dyslexia and such, just to focus on one area of special needs. But possibly this will go a good few steps towards leveling a playing field. If one can blend, if one can open up to a much wider variety of teaching objects, of learning objects, teaching objects, and objectives. And again, also assessment, forms of assessment, not locking ourselves into the old exam type, but rather allowing far more authentic products as a showcase of what one learns.
That's absolutely right. You know, so for example, at the Open University, we have about twice as many. A percentage of our students, about twice as many with a declared disability as is representative in the kind of population as a whole. So lots of students do choose to study with us precisely for those reasons. You know, that you can take your time, and also we provide lots of assistance with kind of assistive technologies and those kind of things. So it does, but also I think issues around mental health. You know, so some of our students tried studying at campus universities and found it very kind of stressful or anxiety-inducing, and either just didn't go on with it for various reasons, but I found the Open University where they can kind of control their environment much more, and that goes back to kind of the idea of agency. That kind of really suits them. So I think we're seeing lots of different, exactly as you say, lots of different reasons for why this model could work. So it was interesting to see there was a piece in Wonky in the UK recently was saying that online learning is elitist and like is bad for widening participation. And it's like, well, that's not true at all. That's exactly why the Open University was set up, was to kind of try and reach those people. So it was interesting the kind of assumptions that people had, you know, that going to a campus full time didn't have all those kind of restrictions built into it.
it may, the issues of inequity may stem more from the hardware, from lack of devices and bandwidth issues and things like that, as well as lack of preparation, lack of training students how to use this completely different approach. But it also has the other side of this could really go a long way to offering opportunities to students who otherwise would not have access.
Yeah, I agree.
So it's definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah. I see Alice had her hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to ask what you thought about the economic opportunities. Again, as I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, was just saying about the digital divide and the lack of bandwidth or availability of Wi-Fi at home. Around here, we had the local school department passed out Chromebooks at the beginning of when everyone went to shelter in place, which is great. But if kids don't have internet at home, then that's going to help them only very slightly. But the divide between those who can afford a university education and room and board in the dormitories, et cetera, versus being able to access online education more in the gig economy kind of style. Do you think that that will undermine the foundation of higher education itself? And if the move goes to a blended approach, then what does that mean for current universities?
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. There's a lot in there, so I might not answer all of those questions. But certainly I think, we have Open University students who study with us specifically so they can carry on working. So for start, in the UK, we pay fees. So most universities charge £9,000 a year to study. We charge £5,000. So it's cheaper. But also, if you're working at the same time, you can more or less you could come out of your study with no student debt. And that's quite an attractive option for lots of students. Whereas if you go to university and you're not working, you need maintenance grants, so you come out with a lot of debt. So there is that model, and as you say, people may have different types of jobs that hold down the whole kind of gig economy thing. And that perhaps is also go back to Jay's point about what are universities for, and the University of Phoenix model of we're here to have a football field, which that's what we're making money on. So, and I think what's the pandemic's exposing is lots of weak points in universities' finances. So kind of certainly in the UK, and it's probably the same there, a real kind of over reliance on international students. Because international students pay about 3 times the amount that home students do. So you suddenly lose all these students from China or whatever, and then lots of universities are suddenly exposed to a lot of kind of big financial black holes. So it's raising a lot of those issues. And I think it also, to put it cynically, I think lots of vice chancellors and principals of universities, when they come in, they like to put up buildings, as a kind of as their legacy. We've got this, here's a new £10 million building. £10 million buys you a lot of online staff development and course material. So. But yeah, I think that the financial implications of this for the higher education model are going to be the real impact, and we'll see that for years. Many universities will go under. So yes, it's going to be interesting what it means to study, what it means to go to university in the future. I don't like to make predictions, so I'm sure some things will go back to normal and some won't. But I think it's but if your model is based on everyone coming to the same place, and also just the money they make off things like coffee and alcohol and food outlets, it's like these are the things that actually really drive a lot of the revenue in universities. And if suddenly you've got a third of the people on campus, that's a kind of a big hit for those things.
Sam, I think that Sam, let us get the last one for Sam, because then we're going to try and sum up, but please.
Thank you. Just to follow up on this point that you're making, you kind of mentioned one of the bumps along the road was people realizing that online education is not necessarily cheaper than kind of conventional physical education. But now you're pointing out the cost saving opportunities. I'm actually sit on the board of a school here, and we're particularly looking at this now. So just if you could expand a little bit on when it does save money and when it doesn't.
Sorry, it's not cheaper to produce. So I think the idea is lots of universities think, hey, we could do online learning. That's really cheap, right? We just point a camera at a lecturer and we can share it to 10,000 people. But actually good online learning is usually developed by a multidisciplinary team. It takes a long time to produce. Our courses go through critical readers to make sure the students understand what's going on. So it's not cheap to produce. But it could be cheap to study in some ways. So there's a difference from the producer end and the consumer end, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Good, thanks.
Okay, and I will jump in now. I think one of the things we also have to learn about online education is that we're all time, what's the word? Confined. And so we try to start on time, we try to end on time. So I'm going to try and wrap up. I'd like to, one comment, I think that at least for some of us here this evening, Martin should have said that we should have tissues by us ready because it was a walk down memory lane and I was feeling all sorts of nostalgia for some of the things which I remember from years and years ago, but that's not necessarily the reason to do this. Thank you very, very much for a very wide overview of the things, and I think we all got a good deal out of the things that you presented to us. Next Thursday, that's a week from this Thursday, Paul, who is with us at the moment, with Rob will be presenting. We're looking forward to that. Next week, next Tuesday and Monday, Ruthie, who wasn't here this evening because she just told me an hour ago that her daughter gave birth to a grandchild and she had to take care of a grandchild. So she wasn't available, intending to come in today, but I think it was a little bit premature, but not much. So she will be presenting, hopefully with a baby in her hands or something like that, next Monday. And this Thursday, someone whom I've known for many, many years will be presenting as well. I hope it'll be interesting. And that's me, by the way. And we're looking forward. I hope that in this time of so many Zooms taking place and so many seminars and so much of this, we're talking about what's happening to education, how and why, and sometimes there are 400 people listening to something which isn't necessarily making sense. Sometimes a small group of people who wants to listen to an interesting topic and get into it and sink its teeth in makes it all worthwhile. So I thank you very, very much for being with us this evening. And we look forward, there will be a recording and we will be sending out a PDF of the presentation. And I look forward to seeing you again in a couple of days. Thank you very, very much and good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good evening.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Jay.
Happily.